Hi everyone and welcome to the tutorial. Today I'm going to be demonstrating how to work the cable cast on method. This cast on is very similar to the knitted cast on method, so if you've ever used that technique you'll see the similarities to this and it should be quite easy to pick up. The cable cast on method creates quite a firm edge, but I think it's a really neat one, so I do quite like it for starting off things like shawls and sweaters where the cast on edge is exposed. So I've got my working yarn here and I've got my needles. What I'm going to do to start my cast on off, I know that a lot of people like to create a slip knot and pop that on their needle as the first stitch, and you can absolutely do that, but there is a way that you can create your first stitch instead of the slip knot without creating a knot, and that's by simply draping your yarn over the needle. So I've got my tail end of yarn here, and then this yarn is attached to the ball. That's my working yarn. And what I'm going to do is drape the yarn over the left hand needle so that the tail end is going over the back of the needle and the working yarn is coming over the front, just like that. And that is my first stitch. Now obviously this is totally unsecure at the moment and we need to stabilize it so that this just doesn't come undone, and we're going to do that while also creating our second stitch. So what I'm going to do is take the working yarn and make sure it's sort of crossing over and in front of the tail end of yarn, and then I'm going to take my right hand needle and I'm going to insert it behind that yarn, just like that. That's not inserted into anything, it's just sitting behind everything. And then with the working yarn, I'll just pop that back on the needle. The working yarn is going to be wrapped around that right hand needle while crossing over the tail end of yarn. I'm then going to draw that newly created loop on my right hand needle behind the loop on the left hand needle, and then we're going to pull it a bit loose and then place it onto the left hand needle without twisting it. And there we have our first stitch that is now secure, and we've created a second stitch. Now the repeat of the cast on is to take your right hand needle and insert it between the last created stitch and the stitch just before that are on your left hand needle. So I'm just going to insert the needle between those stitches. I'm not inserting into the loop, and that's the difference between this method and the knitted cast on method. For the knitted cast on method you actually insert into the front leg of your last work stitch, but we're actually going to go between that stitch and the one before it. Then I'm going to wrap the working yarn around the needle as if to knit, and then I'm going to draw that yarn between the two stitches, which creates a loop, and then I'm going to place that loop on the left hand needle, which creates a stitch. And then we just keep repeating that. Insert the right hand needle between the last created stitch and the one just before it on your left hand needle, wrap the working yarn around as if to knit, and then draw that yarn between those stitches and then place the newly created loop on your left hand needle. Couple of things to be mindful of with this technique. It can get quite tight, and so you want to be really mindful that you're making your loops as loosely as possible. So I haven't tightened that stitch because as soon as I insert my needle in, it's going to sort of become a bit more rigid. I want that elasticity of the stitch being loose because it's going to help me to actually draw the loop that I'm creating back through between those stitches. If it's too tight, it's really hard to do that. And I'm not just inserting the pointy tip of my needle, I'm actually inserting the entire needle through to the point where it is the full circumference of the needle. So I'm not just going through that pointy bit, I'm actually going through the full shaft of the needle and then wrapping the yarn around, because that will also help to loosen everything up. And then, didn't quite make it, so try that again. Wrap around and draw the loop through and place on the needle. So if I only inserted the very tip of the needle and pulled everything, it can be quite tricky to pull that through, although that just worked then. But if you're finding that it is too tight, just make sure you use those tips to loosen up your stitches. And so I'm just repeating that a bit quicker now, going through between those stitches, drawing a loop through and placing it on the needle, between those stitches, wrapping the yarn around, drawing a loop through and then placing it on the needle. And that's all you do as a repeat to create however many stitches you need for your cast on. So if you were counting this, you count that first loop and you would count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. So I've cast on 11 stitches. And you can see what that cast on edge looks like. I think that's really nice and neat. This is the right side. On the wrong side, it has more of an appearance of like pearl bumps under the needle, and maybe that's what you want to have visible on your project. Maybe that's the decorative effect you're going for. But generally, this is the edge that you would want visible on the right side of your work. And so your first row, you just have your working yarn there and you knit across these stitches, and generally your first row will be a right side row so that this is on the right side of your work. But that's the cable cast on method. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions or comments, do leave them below.